The night was still in Oak Creek Estates, the quiet that promised safety. But that promise shattered in a single strike, the crack of a police baton against glass, echoing through manicured streets. A black father, a husband, a man who had given his life to serve justice, stood frozen as shards of his own car window rained down at his feet. In that moment, dignity collided with prejudice, and what began as a simple move into a new home became a confrontation that would shake the nation to its core. This is not just a story about a window breaking. It's about the invisible lines of suspicion drawn against the color of a man's skin. It's about a family's search for peace in a world that still questions their place. And it's about how, in the face of humiliation and abuse of power, one man's silence, one man's restraint, could turn into the loudest call for justice. Anthony Carter had dreamed of this moment for years. At 52, after a career defined by service, discipline, and sacrifice, he was finally carrying boxes into a house that felt like the culmination of everything he had worked for. Oak Creek Estates looked like peace itself. Wide driveways framed by trimmed hedges, roses blooming in neat rows, sprinklers ticking in the distance, and the faint laughter of children riding their bicycles under the safe shadow of gated walls. For Anthony, this place was supposed to be a promise, a symbol to his wife, Sarah, and their 14-year-old daughter Maya that life could slow down now, that they had earned the right to breathe. Yet peace, as he would learn, can be fragile when your skin tells a story the neighborhood refuses to hear. He parked his black Lincoln Navigator in the driveway, the sun reflecting warmly off the windshield. His shirt clung slightly to his back as he lifted a heavy box labeled Maya's Memories. Inside were photo albums, her kindergarten art, and the plaster handprints she had made years ago. Holding that box felt grounding. It was more valuable than the four-bedroom house itself. He smiled as Sarah stepped into the doorway of the garage, brushing her hair back with the back of her wrist, eyes sparkling with quiet satisfaction. But then, as Anthony turned, the sound of an engine idling broke the harmony. A police cruiser rolled past once, then circled back, slowing in front of the house with the kind of deliberate hesitation that spoke louder than sirens. Anthony paused, the box still in his arms. The officer behind the wheel lowered his window, eyes pale and sharp like a hawk spotting prey. His name was Officer Mark Doyle, and though Anthony had never met him, Doyle had already decided what kind of man Anthony was. In Doyle's eyes, this was not a homeowner. This was a question mark. A glitch. A black man unloading boxes in front of the old Henderson property, and that fact alone was enough to stir suspicion. "Afternoon," Doyle called, his voice louder than necessary. It wasn't a greeting, it was a probe, a reminder that he was the gatekeeper here. Anthony placed the box carefully on the driveway, straightened his back, and gave a polite nod. He had learned across 3 decades in law enforcement that tone mattered, posture mattered. Every detail mattered when you were a black man being measured by another man's prejudice. Doyle cut his engine, the sudden silence tightening the air. He stepped out slowly, his hand resting casually on his holstered Glock, an unspoken performance of power. He glanced at the Lincoln Navigator, then at Anthony's athletic build, then back to the house. "Big place," Doyle said, the words dangling like a challenge. "Must be doing all right for yourself." The insinuation was as clear as the sweat dripping down the side of his temple. "How could you afford this?" Anthony met his stare without blinking. "We feel very fortunate," he said evenly, refusing to justify his existence. Doyle took a step closer, boots crunching on gravel, and Sarah's smile faded into unease as she watched from the garage. "Mind if I see some identification? Just a routine check. A lot of break-ins around here lately." It was a lie. Oak Creek hadn't had a reported break-in in years, but the truth didn't matter when suspicion lived in the officer's eyes. Anthony's jaw tightened. He wanted to protect the peace of this day. Yet he knew that compliance would teach Maya the wrong lesson, that their rights could be questioned simply because of their skin. Calmly, he said, "I'm on my own property, officer, and I haven't committed a crime. I'm not required to show identification." For Anthony, it was a statement of fact, grounded in law. For Doyle, it was defiance. The officer's jaw clenched, a small muscle twitching as if daring Anthony to continue. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a growl that still carried. "Yeah? Well, from where I'm standing, you could be part of a moving crew casing the place. You people think you're smarter than the rest of us. Sarah's hand gripped the door frame, her knuckles whitening. Anthony glanced at her, just for a heartbeat, and Doyle saw that flicker of connection as weakness. He smirked, lips curling into poison. "Yeah, listen to your wife. Be a good boy and show me your papers." The words struck like a whip. History was embedded in them, the centuries of belittling language designed to strip dignity. Anthony's chest rose slowly, breath measured, but inside, his blood burned. He shook his head once, firm. No. It was a simple word, but in that charged driveway, it carried the weight of centuries. Doyle's face twisted with rage, his hand twitching toward his belt. The atmosphere thickened, neighbors' curtains fluttering as eyes peeked through glass. Anthony stood firm, a father and husband unwilling to surrender his dignity in front of his daughter. He had trained men in de-escalation, taught them to remain calm when adrenaline surged. Now, he was living the very lesson. But Doyle was not looking for calm. He was looking for control. The silence between them became suffocating until Sarah's trembling voice broke it. "Anthony, please, just show him. It's not worth it." Her plea was love, but it pierced Anthony's heart. How many times had she carried this quiet fear, worried he might not come home after an encounter like this? And here, in their new home, it had followed them through the gates meant to keep danger out. Doyle sneered, sensing the tension, feeding on it. His boots scraped against the driveway as he stepped closer, the sun casting his shadow long and dark across the Carter family's new beginning. Anthony squared his shoulders, ready for whatever came next. He didn't know then that what began as a move into a dream house would turn into a battlefield that tested not only his composure, but the very meaning of justice. And with that, the scene was set for the storm that would shatter glass, dignity, and illusions of safety. The driveway was no longer just a place to unload boxes. It had become the front line of a conflict between prejudice and principle, and the battle was only beginning, leading us into the next chapter, the gatekeeper with a badge. For 6 years, Officer Mark Doyle had driven the same circuit through Oak Creek Estates. Every manicured lawn, every mailbox, every gardener's van, he had memorized them like entries in a ledger. To the residents, he was a familiar presence, the man who made sure delivery trucks didn't linger, who stopped teenagers from skateboarding on cul-de-sacs, who once retrieved a lost golden retriever. But beneath that polite exterior was something darker. A man who believed the neighborhood belonged to him, that his badge granted him the authority not just to protect, but to define who deserved to live within its gates. Doyle thought of himself as the gatekeeper of order, and he relished that role. To him, Oak Creek was more than a patrol, it was his kingdom, and kingdoms, in his mind, had no room for outsiders. That was why, when he saw Anthony Carter unloading boxes from a gleaming Lincoln Navigator, the scene instantly registered as an intrusion. Doyle didn't see a family building a home. He saw a breach in the invisible wall of privilege he policed. His pale blue eyes, always narrowed, were lenses ground by suspicion, and in Anthony he saw something he didn't trust. Confidence. Calm. The quiet strength of a man who didn't shrink under authority. To Doyle, that was the most dangerous thing of all. Authority was supposed to be unquestioned. And yet here stood Anthony Carter on his own driveway, not bowing to it. Doyle stepped closer, his hand brushing his holstered Glock like a pianist testing keys before a performance. He didn't need to draw it, the gesture alone was part of the ritual. Show dominance. Create fear. Control the script. "You think this neighborhood is just another stop?" Doyle muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Anthony to hear. "People here work hard to keep it safe. Don't bring trouble with you." Anthony inhaled slowly, steady as a stone. He had endured stares before, the kind that tried to strip him of belonging. But in Doyle's posture, in the gleam of his baton hanging by his hip, he recognized something volatile. This wasn't just prejudice. This was a man searching for confrontation. From the garage, Sarah called, "Anthony?" Her voice carried the tremor of someone who already knew how this would play out. Too many news stories, too many names etched into hashtags, too many funerals dressed in quiet outrage. Doyle glanced at her briefly, then smirked. "You folks moving into the Henderson place? Funny. Never thought I'd see the day." He let the words linger, loaded with implication. Anthony kept his voice calm. "It's our home now." Doyle tilted his head, as though the statement itself was defiance. "Our?" The single syllable dripped with venom, as if the concept of ownership was too heavy to rest on Anthony's shoulders. Anthony folded his arms lightly, not defensive, just steady. My wife and daughter are inside. We're settling in. That's all. Doyle shook his head slowly, as though correcting a child. That's not all. See, when something doesn't fit, I make it my job to figure out why. You, he jabbed a finger toward Anthony, the gesture quick, sharp. You don't fit. The silence that followed was suffocating. Birds had stopped chirping. Even the sprinklers seemed to pause. Doyle's voice dropped into something harder. Show me your ID, or things are going to get difficult. Anthony's heart pounded, but his voice stayed steady. You have no probable cause, officer. I'm not required to comply. The exchange was more than words. It was a clash of worldviews, one man wielding power like a club, the other clinging to dignity as a shield. Doyle's eyes flared. He wasn't used to resistance. He was used to heads bowed, wallets pulled out, obedience without question. But here was a man who didn't bend, and that refusal ignited something ugly deep inside him. He leaned closer, so close Anthony could smell the stale coffee on his breath. Don't play games with me, Doyle hissed. Men like you always think you can outsmart the badge. But out here, I decide who belongs. Anthony didn't flinch. Instead, he spoke softly, with the kind of patience that enraged men like Doyle. Respect goes both ways, officer. And right now, you're on my property. Doyle's nostrils flared. The balance of power was tilting, and he could feel it slipping. His knuckles whitened as his hand flexed near his baton. He wanted to reassert control, to remind everyone watching Sarah in the garage, neighbors behind their curtains, Maya peeking nervously from the window that he was the law here. And in his world, the law didn't bend to black men standing proud in front of big houses. The standoff grew heavier with each breath. Anthony's refusal to cower was fuel to Doyle's fire. Sarah stepped forward now, her voice breaking. Please, officer, we just want to settle in. There's no need for this. But Doyle didn't hear her plea. He heard an audience. And for men like Doyle, an audience was never a call for restraint. It was a stage. His voice grew louder, sharper, a performance meant to echo across the manicured lawns. This is what happens when you don't cooperate with law enforcement. His words weren't directed at Anthony anymore. They were directed at the invisible jury of neighbors, at the cameras that would soon appear, at the myth of authority he clung to. Anthony's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he forced them to relax. He knew the trap. One raised hand, one aggressive gesture, and the story would flip Anthony the aggressor, Doyle the brave officer. He couldn't give him that. But Doyle was spiraling, his temper a fuse burning fast. He stepped back half a pace, fingers brushing the baton at his side, eyes blazing with the certainty of a man who believed the badge excused everything. Sarah gasped, sensing what was coming. Anthony lowered his voice, speaking not just to Doyle but to his wife, his daughter, and every watching neighbor. You're escalating this for no reason, but I won't let you take my dignity with your demands. It was a line drawn in silence, a refusal more powerful than any weapon. And in that moment, Doyle felt the sting of losing control. His authority, his so-called guardianship of Oak Creek, was being questioned in real time, and nothing enraged him more. He gritted his teeth, eyes narrowing into slits. You don't get to walk away from me. The promise in his voice was chilling, a prelude to violence. Anthony's pulse thundered in his ears, but his face betrayed nothing. He knew the moment of eruption was close, inevitable. Oak Creek Estates was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage set for a clash that would test the very fabric of justice. The gatekeeper had drawn his line. The question now was how far he would go to enforce it. And as Doyle's hand tightened around the baton, the answer loomed closer, carrying us into the next chapter, the clash of principles on the driveway. The air on the driveway was thick with a tension so sharp it seemed to slice through the sunlight. Anthony Carter stood firm, his arms relaxed at his sides but his posture unyielding, a quiet declaration that he would not be moved by intimidation. Officer Mark Doyle loomed closer, his pale blue eyes narrowing to slits, his hand resting heavy on his baton as though the metal rod itself whispered permission. It wasn't just a request for identification anymore. It was a test of obedience, a demand that Anthony surrender dignity in exchange for peace, and Anthony refused. With all due respect, officer, Anthony said, his voice calm but edged with steel. I am standing on my own property. I haven't committed a crime. You have no right to demand my identification. His words hung in the air, measured, deliberate. It wasn't defiance for the sake of defiance, it was principle. Doyle's jaw clenched, a pulse twitching at his temple. He had expected compliance, maybe even fear. Instead, he was staring into the eyes of a man who would not bend, a man whose very presence undermined the power Doyle believed he held over this street, this neighborhood, this kingdom. Is that so? Doyle's voice dropped lower, colder, carrying the threat of consequences. From where I'm standing, you look suspicious. For all I know, you could be casing the place. Moving boxes doesn't prove a thing. Anthony took a slow breath, steadying himself. That's my wife in the garage. My daughter is inside. This is our home. You have no reason to be here. He gestured toward Sarah, who now stood rigid in the doorway, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. Doyle glanced at her but dismissed her presence with a curl of his lip. He wasn't interested in facts. He was interested in control. He stepped closer, boots grinding against the driveway gravel, until he was inside Anthony's personal space, their bodies separated by little more than breath. Listen to me carefully, Doyle hissed, his voice sharp enough to cut. You don't get to tell me how to do my job. When I give an order, you follow it. That's how this works. Anthony could smell the sour tang of coffee on Doyle's breath, feel the heat of rage radiating from the man's body. Years of training screamed at him to de-escalate, to keep calm, but there was a deeper voice rising now, forged in decades of enduring the same silent accusation. You don't belong. He would not pass that lesson down to Maya. Respect goes both ways, Anthony said firmly, his voice low but unshaken. And right now, you're the one crossing the line. The words were simple, but they struck Doyle harder than any insult. He saw not fear, not submission, but resolve, and that defiance lit the fuse of his temper. His lips curled back in a sneer. Good boy, he spat, the phrase dripping with venom, centuries of racial poison condensed into 2 words. Sarah gasped, the sound raw, involuntary, as if the words had cut through her. Anthony's chest tightened, his heart pounding in his ears, but his face remained still. That phrase was designed to break him, to shrink him down to something less than a man. And it would have, if not for the presence of his wife watching, his daughter listening from the window, the neighbor's curtains twitching as cameras began to appear. He could not surrender here, not to that. He shook his head once, slow, deliberate. No, he said, the single syllable carrying the weight of every refusal to bow, every quiet act of resistance passed down through generations. Doyle recoiled as though struck, his face contorting with disbelief and rage. He had pushed and, for the first time in years, someone hadn't moved. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. Doyle's hand slid to his belt, fingers brushing the baton, his body trembling with adrenaline. Sarah's voice broke through the stillness, sharp with fear. Anthony, please, just show him it's not worth it. Anthony's gaze flicked to her, to the terror in her eyes, and it cut him to the bone. She had lived with this fear for years, the constant dread that one wrong encounter could end everything. She deserved peace. This was supposed to be their peace. But Doyle saw that flicker of doubt in Anthony's eyes and mistook it for weakness. A cruel smile spread across his face. Yeah, Doyle sneered. Listen to your wife. Be a good boy. Show me your papers. The words landed like a slap across the driveway. Anthony's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced them open, breathing through the surge of fury. He would not be reduced to a stereotype, would not give Doyle the satisfaction of rewriting the story as angry black man versus officer. His refusal was stronger than any strike. He looked Doyle in the eye, steady as stone. No. The officer's face twisted, rage boiling over. The refusal was no longer about ID, it was about dominance, about a system that demanded submission and crumbled when denied it. Doyle's voice turned into a growl. You think you're better than me? You move into this neighborhood and think the rules don't apply? You think you can stand here and tell me what I can and can't do? Anthony didn't move, didn't blink. His silence was its own answer, and in that silence, Doyle heard the shattering of his illusion of control. The officer's breathing grew ragged, his body trembling with fury. He was a hammer, and in front of him was a man who refused to be a nail. The driveway had become a battlefield of wills, and Doyle was losing. He couldn't accept that. He wouldn't. All right, Doyle snarled, his voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "You're done." His hand snapped to his baton, flicking it open with a sharp metallic shing that echoed like a warning shot. Sarah gasped, clutching the doorway. From the upstairs window, Maya's small face appeared, eyes wide with terror. Anthony's body tensed, instinct urging him to defend himself, to protect his family. But he held his ground, hands raised slightly, palms open, a universal sign of peace. "Think about what you're doing, officer," he said, voice steady but firm. "There is no threat here. You are the threat." The words sliced through the charged air, a mirror held up to Doyle's aggression. But Doyle's rage only deepened. He brandished the baton, pointing it toward the Lincoln Navigator. "Then maybe your IDs are in the car. I'll find it myself." He stepped toward the driver's side window, raising the weapon high. Anthony's heart slammed against his ribs. He knew what was coming. The moment was seconds away, inevitable. The principals clashing on this driveway had lit a fuse neither man could extinguish. And when the baton came crashing down, it wouldn't just shatter glass, it would shatter illusions, ignite a firestorm, and drag an entire neighborhood into the spotlight of justice. The clash of principles was no longer theoretical. It was about to explode into action, carrying us into the next chapter, the baton and the shattered glass. The baton snapped open with a metallic crack that pierced the quiet like a gunshot. In the stillness of Oak Creek Estates, where the loudest sound most evenings was the hum of sprinklers, that shing was violence before it even landed. Officer Mark Doyle's pale eyes gleamed with adrenaline, his chest heaving, his entire body coiled like a spring that had been wound too tight for too long. This was no longer a question of identification, no longer an encounter between a police officer and a homeowner. This was an eruption of prejudice dressed in the uniform of authority, and Anthony Carter stood at the center of it. "Officer," Anthony said, his voice calm but firm, his palms still raised. "Put the baton away. There is no threat here. You're the only danger on this street right now." But Doyle was past hearing reason. His hands trembled, not with fear but with the intoxication of unchecked power. He wasn't listening to Anthony's words, he was listening to the roar of his own ego, the need to dominate, the need to prove that no one defied him and walked away untouched. Sarah's scream cut across the driveway. "Stop it, please!" She gripped the garage frame so hard her knuckles whitened, her body trembling as she watched the officer advance. Upstairs, Maya's face appeared in the window, small hands pressed against the glass, her wide eyes brimming with tears. Doyle moved quickly, boots grinding on gravel, the baton rising above his shoulder. He didn't swing for Anthony, not yet. He swung for the car. The sound was catastrophic. The baton smashed into the Lincoln Navigator's window with a deafening crack, and the tempered glass exploded into 1,000 tiny fractures, spreading like a spiderweb of violence across the surface. Shards flew inward, glittering in the sunlight, scattering across the leather seats. The sound carried through the cul-de-sac, sharp enough to silence even the birds. Curtains twitched. A door opened. The neighborhood, so carefully curated to be insulated from chaos, had just been cracked open, and the ugliness poured in. Anthony's heart dropped as he stared at the fractured window, the starburst pattern etched forever in his memory. That window had been his shield, his boundary, a piece of the sanctuary he had worked his whole life to give his family. Now it lay ruined, violated, by a man who couldn't stand the sight of him standing tall in front of his own home. He turned slowly to face Doyle, who stood panting, chest heaving, face flushed with the manic triumph of a man who believed he had just won. The baton dangled in his grip, flecks of glass glittering on its tip like fragments of stolen dignity. But it wasn't Doyle's face that broke Anthony's heart, it was Maya's. She had run down to the garage now, her small body frozen beside her mother, her hand clapped over her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. She had come to see the new house, to imagine laughter and bike rides in the cul-de-sac. And instead she was seeing her father's dignity attacked, his family threatened, their safety shattered as easily as the glass. The box on the driveway, Maya's memories, seemed to mock the moment. Its label screamed louder than Doyle's baton. Childhood drawings, photos, plaster handprints of innocence. And now, right in front of those artifacts of a young girl's life, an officer of the law had shown her what the world still thought of her family. Something inside Anthony shifted. The anger that had been tightly leashed all these years, managed through training, contained by discipline, hardened into something sharper, resolve. He would not explode. He would not lash out. That was the trap. Doyle wanted to turn this into a story of aggression rather than oppression. No, Anthony's resistance would be colder, harder, more unshakable than rage. The sound of the shattered glass was a starting gun. One by one, neighbors emerged from their pristine homes. First, an elderly man watering flowers, then a couple walking their golden retriever, then two, then three more families who drifted onto lawns, their eyes wide, their phones already in hand. Screens rose into the air like a forest of silent witnesses, their lenses trained on the driveway. Doyle saw them, and instead of retreating, he puffed out his chest. The audience emboldened him. He wasn't just an officer anymore, he was performing. His voice grew louder, designed to carry to every ear and every camera. "This is what happens," he shouted, baton still raised, "when you refuse to cooperate with law enforcement." The words echoed, a declaration of power twisted into justification. But the cameras captured more than his voice. They captured Anthony's stillness, his refusal to bend, Sarah's fear, Maya's tears, and the shattered glass glinting like evidence under the Sunday. Anthony's hands remained raised, his face calm but his eyes blazing. "You've destroyed my property. You've assaulted me in front of my family. This is over." His voice was low, steady, but carried the authority of a man who would not be broken. Doyle barked a laugh, harsh and ugly. "Over? I'm the one with the badge and the gun. You're the one going to jail." He snapped his baton closed, holstered it, and unclipped his handcuffs. The metallic click rang across the driveway like another gunshot. Sarah cried out, "No, he's done nothing wrong." But Doyle didn't even glance at her. His eyes were locked on Anthony, his voice dripping with venom. "Turn around. Hands behind your back. You're under arrest for obstruction and resisting." Anthony's heart thudded. He could end this in 2 seconds. He had the training, the strength, the technique to disarm Doyle and put him on the ground. But he didn't move. He knew the narrative. One shove, one strike, and every camera would flip the story. He would become the aggressor, the threat, the stereotype Doyle wanted him to be. So he let Doyle grab his arm, let the rough hand shove him against the side of the shattered car. The jagged glass scraped his back, each sting a reminder of the humiliation he was enduring. "Stop resisting," Doyle growled, though Anthony stood perfectly still, muscles locked, refusing to give him the satisfaction of struggle. The driveway had transformed fully now, not into a place of moving boxes, but into a public stage. The neighbors were no longer just residents, they were witnesses. The phones were no longer just devices, they were evidence. And the story unfolding was no longer private. It was a mirror held up to a nation, reflecting the raw truth of bias and abuse of power. Anthony clenched his jaw, not against Doyle's grip, but against the deeper pain of knowing his daughter was watching. That every clang of the handcuffs, every cruel word, would be a memory she would carry. He had fought wars in silence, trained agents in restraint, and spent decades navigating the corridors of power with quiet dignity. And now, here, on his own driveway, his battle had found him again. The shattered glass glittered at his feet, 1,000 fragments of a dream broken. But he knew this wasn't the end. This was the beginning. For in those tiny shards lay a reflection of something larger, a system fractured, a prejudice exposed, a truth that could no longer be hidden behind gated walls. And as Doyle's handcuffs hovered inches from Anthony's wrists, the cameras rolled, the neighbors watched, and the line between silence and justice grew sharper. The baton had shattered more than glass. It had shattered the illusion that Oak Creek was untouchable, that prejudice could be hidden behind wealth, that dignity could be erased without consequence. The clash was no longer just between two men. It was between two truths, two Americas, colliding on a single driveway. And with every breath, Anthony prepared himself for what came next. The battle was not over. It was only shifting, carrying us into the next chapter, the neighbor's verdict. The sound of breaking glass still lingered in the air like the last note of a funeral bell when the first neighbor stepped onto his lawn. An elderly man in khakis and a pressed polo shirt, holding a garden hose that now dangled forgotten at his side, stared at the shattered window of Anthony's Lincoln Navigator. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. He had lived here long enough to know Oak Creek was supposed to be a fortress of calm, a place where conflict belonged on television screens, not manicured driveways. Yet here it was, unfolding like a slow-motion disaster in front of his eyes. Within minutes, More doors opened. Curtains twitched wider. A teenage boy slipped onto his porch with a phone already recording, the red light blinking like an accusation. A young mother, clutching her toddler, emerged, whispering hurriedly into her Bluetooth headset to someone miles away about something happening on Carter Street. Then came the others, trickling out of their perfect homes, faces a mixture of curiosity and alarm, as though they couldn't quite believe what their eyes were showing them. And almost without hesitation, hands rose, holding phones aloft. 1 lens, 2, 5, a dozen. Each screen became a mirror, capturing every flinch, every word, every gesture, transforming the driveway into an open-air courtroom where judgment would be swift and merciless. Officer Doyle felt the shift instantly. To some men, witnesses bring shame, restraint. To Doyle, they brought fuel. His chest expanded, his voice grew louder, sharper, carried now not for Anthony but for the invisible jury watching through glass and pixels. "This is what happens," he shouted, baton still glinting with shards of glass. "When you refuse to cooperate with law enforcement." He turned slightly, angling his body to give the phones a better view. His words rehearsed like a script he had repeated in his head for years. To him, this was no longer a confrontation. It was a theater. He was the star, and Anthony was cast unwillingly as the villain. But the cameras also saw Anthony's calm, his hands raised in surrender, his face resolute, his body still despite the rough shoves of Doyle's grip. They saw Sarah clutching Maya to her side, the child trembling, tears streaking her cheeks. They saw dignity under assault. And though Doyle tried to spin the narrative, the silent judgment of lenses had already begun. Anthony's voice cut through, low but steady. "You've destroyed my property. You've terrified my family. You've crossed every line. This is over." His words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. The phones caught them, carried them, and immortalized them. Doyle barked a laugh, the kind of cruel bark that cracked like dry wood. "Over? No. You're under arrest. Obstruction. Resisting." His words rang hollow even as he spoke them, but he clung to them, repeating the familiar incantations of authority, hoping the ritual itself could shield him from the reality that he was losing control of the story. The neighbors shifted uneasily. Some looked at each other, whispers passing like sparks through dry grass. Was this really happening? Was a man being arrested on his own driveway for unloading boxes? And yet, the officer's voice kept booming, commanding, trying to drown out the obvious truth captured in their cameras. Anthony's heart pounded. He knew what was at stake. Not just his freedom, not just his dignity, but the story being written in real time across every phone. He could fight. He could throw Doyle to the ground in seconds, humiliate him, and end the confrontation with physical dominance. But the moment he did, the narrative would twist. He would become the aggressor. The neighbor's lenses would frame him as the danger, and Doyle's voice would become gospel. That was the trap. So he did the hardest thing a man could do. He stood still, muscles tight as iron, back pressed against his car, the shattered window biting into his skin, but his body unmoving. "I'm not resisting," Anthony said through clenched teeth, his words deliberate, directed not at Doyle but at the witnesses, at the cameras, at the nation that would soon watch this unfold. "I am standing still." Doyle's face flushed crimson, sweat dripping down his brow. He yanked harder, trying to twist Anthony's arms, desperate to create the illusion of struggle. "Stop resisting," he growled, but the words fell flat against the evidence the cameras were recording. Sarah couldn't hold back any longer. She broke from her frozen stance and shouted, her voice cracking with fury, "Get your hands off my husband! He's done nothing wrong!" Her cry was raw, filled with a desperation that pierced the quiet street. Some neighbors flinched. Others lifted their phones higher, capturing her anguish. Doyle snapped his head toward her, eyes blazing. "Stay back or you're next," he barked, his voice ugly, unhinged. The toddler in the young mother's arms began to cry, the sound mixing with Sarah's sobs, with Maya's muffled whimpering, with the metallic rattle of handcuffs against Anthony's wrist. The perfect street had become a stage of chaos, and everyone watching knew it. But in that chaos, the verdict was already being written not by Doyle's words, but by the phones recording every second. Each lens was an indictment. Each angle was a piece of evidence. Doyle thought he was commanding the narrative, but in reality, the narrative had slipped beyond his grasp. Anthony turned his head slightly, meeting Sarah's tearful eyes, then lifting his gaze to Maya. His chest ached at the fear carved into her young face, but his own expression softened. He needed her to see strength, not fear. He needed her to understand that dignity was not surrendered, even when hands tried to shackle it. "It's all right," he murmured, voice barely audible but caught by a neighbor's microphone. "It's all right." But Doyle's voice thundered over him, desperate to drown out that quiet strength. "Turn around!" he shouted, forcing the cuffs toward Anthony's wrists. His voice cracked now, no longer steady, no longer confident. The performance was fraying at the edges, and the audience could see it. Anthony drew a deep breath, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the story being told in real time. The neighbor's verdict mattered because the neighbor's footage would soon become the world's footage. And in that moment, Anthony made his choice. He would not give Doyle a victory. He would not give prejudice the last word. He would show restraint so powerful, so undeniable, that the truth would be inescapable. The handcuffs hovered, the crowd held its breath, and Anthony's voice, steady as a drumbeat, cut through. "That's enough." The words were not shouted, they were not loud, but they rang with the authority of a man who had carried power his entire life without needing to flaunt it. They carried weight, they carried history, and the cameras caught them. The neighbors exchanged glances. The balance of perception was tilting. The officer, red-faced and trembling, looked like a bully. The man in front of him looked like a victim, but also something more, a man standing taller than the badge aimed to break him. And though no one spoke it aloud, the silent verdict of their eyes, their lenses, their judgment was already forming. This confrontation was no longer private. It belonged to the world now. And Doyle, though he didn't know it yet, was losing. The driveway had turned into a courtroom, the neighbors into a jury, and the cameras into a gavel. And that gavel was about to fall, leading us into the next chapter, the handcuffs of humiliation. The handcuffs dangled in Officer Doyle's trembling grip, gleaming under the afternoon sun like instruments of ritual humiliation. The metallic click of their jaws opening was sharp, deliberate, a sound meant to strip dignity as much as restrain wrists. For Doyle, the cuffs were victory. For Anthony Carter, they were a test. "Turn around," Doyle barked, shoving the cold steel closer. His voice cracked, high and raw, betraying a desperation his posture tried to conceal. The neighbor's camera zoomed in, lenses catching the beads of sweat rolling down his forehead, the twitch of fury in his jaw, the gleam of madness in his pale blue eyes. He wanted control. He wanted submission, and he wanted it now. Anthony stood rooted, a pillar of calm against the storm of aggression pressing down on him. His body radiated strength, but his arms remained loose at his sides. He was not resisting. He was not fighting. Yet the officer's narrative demanded otherwise. "Stop resisting!" Doyle roared, yanking Anthony's left arm and twisting it clumsily behind his back. The irony was searing. Anthony's feet never moved. His muscles were still, his voice steady. But the lie rolled from Doyle's lips like scripture. "I'm not resisting," Anthony said, loud enough for the phones to hear. "I am standing still." His words carried past Doyle's ears, carried into microphones and digital memory, carried into the evidence vault of the internet where lies had no place to hide. Sarah's cry ripped across the driveway. "He's not resisting. Get your hands off him." Her voice was ragged with fear and fury, a sound that shook even some of the neighbors who had lingered at the edges, unsure if they should watch or intervene. Maya clung to her mother's side, her small fists digging into Sarah's blouse, her sobs muffled against her chest. This was not a lesson a child should learn on her first day in a new home, and yet, here it was, carved into her memory by the cold glint of steel and the brutality of a badge misused. Doyle pressed harder, trying to force Anthony's other wrist into the cuffs. But Anthony's body was immovable, solid as stone, his frame refusing to bend into submission. "Hands behind your back," Doyle shouted, his voice climbing higher, more frantic. He leaned all his weight into the effort, his breath hot against Anthony's ear, his movements clumsy, fueled not by skill but by rage. The officer was no longer performing authority, he was flailing, desperate to salvage control. The neighbors saw it. Their phones caught every detail: the officer's red face, the trembling hands, the ridiculous sight of a man in uniform struggling against someone who was not fighting back. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. The story Doyle was trying to tell, the story of the dangerous, resistant suspect, was unraveling in real time. Anthony clenched his jaw. He could end this at any moment. He could twist free, reversed the grip, and put Doyle flat on the ground in seconds. Years of training in defensive tactics had drilled those reflexes into his body. But he didn't, because to strike back would be to lose the war. He had to fight differently. He had to let the truth record itself, even at the cost of humiliation. "I said stop resisting," Doyle bellowed again, his words breaking like waves against rock. The more he shouted, the hollower they became. One neighbor muttered under his breath, "He's not resisting. I can see it." Another nodded, whispering, "This is wrong." The verdict was spreading. The cuffs scraped Anthony's wrist, the steel grazing skin, leaving faint red marks that would fade but never be forgotten. The scrape was small, almost meaningless compared to the weight of years he had carried. But in that moment, it symbolized something bigger, the indignity inflicted upon countless others who never had neighbors filming, who never had evidence to tell the truth. Sarah stepped forward now, trembling but fierce, her voice cutting like a blade. "This is unlawful. You're assaulting him in front of all of us. He's done nothing wrong." Doyle snapped his head toward her, his eyes wild. "Stay back, or you're next," he spat, the threat dripping from his lips like venom. The toddler in the young mother's arms began crying louder. The neighborhood, once so carefully insulated, now echoed with chaos, cries, shouts, the metallic rattle of steel, the heavy panting of a man abusing his power. Anthony closed his eyes for a brief second, centering himself, pulling breath into his lungs like armor. He thought of Maya's tears, of Sarah's trembling, of the neighbor's lenses catching it all. And then, as Doyle yanked again at his arm, Anthony made a decision. He would not only endure this humiliation, he would transform it. He allowed his body to go slack for a moment, the brief illusion of surrender, lulling Doyle into thinking he had won. The officer jerked the cuffs closer, smirking with the manic triumph of a bully. But then Anthony turned his head, slowly, deliberately, until his eyes met Doyle's. The fury in those pale eyes collided with something unshakable, Anthony's resolve. "That's enough," Anthony said, his voice low but resonant, carrying over the street. 2 words, calm, final, and the phones captured every syllable. Doyle froze, stunned by the force behind the quiet command. The crowd shifted again, murmurs rippling through. The balance of perception was tilting faster now. Doyle no longer looked like the hero cop. He looked like a man unraveling in front of an audience. Anthony's gaze swept briefly across the neighbors, their phones raised high, their verdict silent but damning. Then his eyes returned to Doyle, and he spoke louder this time, the weight of his voice undeniable. "You have assaulted me. You have humiliated me in front of my family, and you are done." The steel of the handcuffs slipped from Doyle's sweaty grip, clattering onto the driveway with a metallic clang that sounded like the end of something bigger than just this confrontation. The neighbors gasped. Sarah exhaled a shaky sob of relief. Maya, wide-eyed, tightened her grip on her mother. Doyle stumbled back a step, confusion and rage twisting his face. His authority was crumbling, his performance collapsing under the weight of truth. He had tried to humiliate a man, but humiliation had a strange way of turning, of reflecting on the one who inflicted it. And as Doyle's hands shook, as his voice faltered, as his gaze flicked nervously toward the cameras that refused to blink, Anthony knew the tide was turning. The humiliation was no longer his to carry. It belonged to the man who had tried to wield it like a weapon. The scene had shifted. The cuffs lay abandoned on the driveway. The crowd murmured with growing certainty, and the story was slipping out of Doyle's grasp. The humiliation he had intended for Anthony was now his own, caught forever on a dozen screens. And as the silence stretched, heavy and undeniable, the next move would decide everything. The driveway was no longer just a battlefield. It was a stage of reckoning, and Doyle was about to learn that humiliation, once unleashed, could not be controlled. Which carried us into the next chapter, the revelation of true power. The handcuffs lay on the driveway like discarded relics, their metallic clatter still echoing in the stunned silence. Officer Doyle's chest heaved as he tried to collect himself, but the sheen of sweat on his forehead betrayed the panic simmering beneath his fury. He had wanted obedience, had demanded submission, had tried to script this moment as another victory for authority. Instead, he stood trembling, his badge and baton no longer enough to control the narrative that a dozen neighbors were recording from every angle. Anthony Carter did not move. He stood tall, breathing evenly, his dark eyes locked on Doyle with a composure that was more powerful than any weapon. He had been shoved, humiliated, accused, and threatened. He had endured the sting of prejudice countless times in silence. But this moment was different. This time, the whole neighborhood and soon the whole world was watching. Doyle spat on the ground, his lips curling into a snarl. "You think you can play games with me? You think standing still makes you righteous? You're still going to jail. You don't walk away from me." His voice cracked, pitched high with desperation, but he said it loud, angling his body so the phones could hear. He was still clinging to the performance, still trying to salvage the script. Anthony tilted his head slightly, his voice steady as stone. "No, officer, you don't walk away from this," the neighbors murmured. The balance was tilting, visible in every shifting stance, every widened eye. Doyle's authority was collapsing, and Anthony's quiet defiance was becoming something larger, something undeniable. Then, slowly, deliberately, Anthony did something that made every phone tilt forward, every breath hitch. He reached into his jacket. "Don't even think about it!" Doyle screamed, his hand flying to his holstered Glock, his eyes wide with sudden alarm. The crowd gasped. Sarah's voice broke into a cry. "Anthony!" As if she feared the sound of gunfire would split the afternoon. But Anthony's hand came out not with a weapon, but with a wallet. Black leather, worn from years of service, its edges soft from being carried close to his chest. With one practiced motion, he flipped it open. The crowd leaned in. Doyle's hand froze, hovering just above his gun. His eyes squinted at the glint of gold nestled in the wallet. It wasn't the silver badge of a local department. It wasn't a novelty token. It was heavy, solid, unmistakable. An eagle spread its wings, engraved in intricate detail, the words etched below as clear as sunlight. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Director. The silence was absolute. Even the toddler in the mother's arms stopped crying. The only sound was the faint hiss of the garden hose still spilling water onto the grass, forgotten by the old man who now stood slack-jawed at the edge of his lawn. Doyle's face drained of color, the blood rushing from his cheeks until he looked ghostly pale. His mouth opened, but no sound came. His grip on the holster slackened, his arm falling back to his side. The cuffs he had dropped earlier might as well have been a mirror because in them the truth of his downfall was now reflected. Anthony did not gloat. He did not raise his voice. He simply held the badge steady, inches from Doyle's face, his eyes calm, unflinching. He let the gold do the speaking. He let the silence do the work. For Doyle, the sight was incomprehensible. His brain scrambled to reject it, to frame it as fake, as a trick. "No," he whispered hoarsely. "No, this isn't real. You think this is funny? You're impersonating a federal officer now? Oh, you're in so much trouble." But his voice faltered, cracking as his gaze slid to the other side of the wallet. The commission. The official photo. The name printed in stark black letters. Anthony M. Carter, Director, FBI. The reality hit like a blow to the chest. The man he had called good boy. The man he had shoved, humiliated, and nearly handcuffed in front of his family. The man whose car window he had shattered with his baton. That man wasn't just a homeowner. He wasn't just a husband or father. He was the head of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country. The neighbors gasped in unison. Phones zoomed in, capturing the gold, capturing the trembling officer, capturing the collapse of arrogance in real time. Doyle stumbled backward, as though the badge itself burned his eyes. His hands flew up as if to ward off a ghost. The once swaggering gatekeeper of Oak Creek Estates now looked like a child who had been caught stealing, his authority evaporating in the shadow of something larger than himself. "No, please," he stammered, his voice small, pleading. I didn't know." Anthony closed the wallet slowly, slid it back into his jacket with the measured calm of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to prove who he was. Then, his tone quiet but final, he said, "And that's the problem. You didn't care to know. You saw only what you wanted to see. And for that, Officer Doyle, you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." The words fell like a gavel striking wood. The driveway was no longer Doyle's stage. It was Anthony's courtroom now, and the jury neighbors with their phones had already delivered their silent verdict. Sarah's eyes brimmed with tears, not just of fear but of relief. Maya stared at her father with new eyes, seeing him not only as dad, but as something greater, an immovable force, a man who could transform humiliation into power without raising a hand. Doyle's hands shook violently as he fumbled for his radio. His voice, once so commanding, now quivered as he stammered into the mic. "Dispatch. I... I need a supervisor at my location. Immediately." The request was barely audible, swallowed by the murmur of neighbors, by the clicking of phones capturing every detail, by the weight of shame pressing down on him. The man who had swaggered onto Carter Street like a king now stood as a beggar before his own downfall. Anthony turned, no longer looking at Doyle, acknowledging him. He looked at Sarah, at Maya, at the fractured box labeled Maya's Memories, still sitting on the driveway. He bent down, lifted it gently into his arms, and spoke softly to his wife. "Let's go inside. I think the officer will be waiting for his commanding officer now." The statement was casual, but its message thundered. Doyle was irrelevant. He was already finished. And as Anthony carried the box toward his home, the silence of the neighborhood broke. A single siren wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second, racing toward the street where a man's arrogance had collided with justice. The revelation had been made, and its impact would ripple far beyond Oak Creek Estates. For Doyle, the humiliation was only beginning. For Anthony, the battle was shifting from the driveway to the nation. And for the watching neighbors, the truth was undeniable. Power had just changed hands. Which leads us into the next chapter, Viral Flames of Justice. The siren wailed closer, its echo weaving through the manicured streets of Oak Creek Estates, but it was already too late. The true alarm had been sounded not by flashing lights, but by the small red dots blinking on neighbors' phones. In every direction, screens had captured the entire sequence: the shouts, the baton, the shattering glass, the handcuffs, the badge. By the time Doyle's panicked call for a supervisor reached dispatch, the first videos were already uploading, racing faster than any cruiser to the eyes of the world. It began with a teenage boy on his porch. He tapped share, almost without thinking, posting the clip to his feed with a caption that read, "Cops harass new black family in Oak Creek. He wasn't resisting. Look what they did." Within minutes, likes turned to retweets, retweets into reposts, and reposts into an inferno. Hashtags sparked like brushfire. Number Carter Driveway, number Justice at Home, number No More Silence. By nightfall, the clips were everywhere: Twitter feeds, Instagram reels, TikTok montages. Some were edited with dramatic music, others slowed to show Anthony's calm refusal, his hands raised, his voice steady. "I am not resisting. I am standing still." Overlaid text read, "This is America, 2026. News stations scrambled to verify. Producers called residents, reporters chased down bystanders, and anchors teased breaking stories with grave faces. The image of the shattered Lincoln Navigator window became iconic, looping endlessly on cable news with headlines scrolling across the bottom: "Local officer accused of excessive force against black homeowner." But what truly ignited the blaze was the twist. One video, shot by the young mother clutching her toddler, caught it perfectly. Doyle shoving, shouting, sweating, then freezing as Anthony pulled out the black leather wallet. The zoom was shaky, but the moment the gold FBI badge flashed, the crowd gasped audibly. The caption she typed before posting sealed the narrative. "He tried to arrest the FBI director in his own driveway." It was the kind of twist too sharp for fiction. Comment sections exploded. "Unbelievable. Poetic justice. This is why we record everything." Conspiracy threads spun wild theories. Was Doyle set up? Was it a sting operation? But the truth was simpler, uglier. An officer blinded by prejudice had humiliated a man whose authority dwarfed his own, and the cameras had captured it all. Doyle's name leaked within hours. Photos of him in uniform circulated alongside the clips, memes sprouting like weeds. One showed him standing proudly at a community barbecue months earlier, captioned, "From neighborhood hero to national disgrace." Another showed Anthony calm and tall, the word dignity stamped across his face. In Washington, phones buzzed in offices from the Department of Justice to Capitol Hill. Senators' aides whispered about the Oak Creek footage. Civil rights leaders drafted statements overnight. Advocacy groups seized on the moment, releasing videos of their own, weaving Anthony's ordeal into a broader tapestry of racial profiling and systemic abuse. Meanwhile, in Oak Creek, the fire spread not just digitally, but emotionally. Some neighbors defended Doyle, muttering about misunderstandings and stress. Others, their phones still warm from recording, admitted the truth aloud for the first time. They had seen with their own eyes what bias looked like in real time. The gated walls had not kept ugliness out, it had been wearing a badge inside all along. For Sarah, the viral storm was surreal. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table, phone buzzing with message after message from friends, colleagues, even strangers. She scrolled through comment threads filled with outrage, with sympathy, with disbelief. One clip showed her crying out, her voice breaking as she begged Doyle to stop. Seeing it replayed again and again was like living the nightmare in a loop. She closed the phone, tears streaming down her face, whispering to herself, "The whole world knows now." Maya sat beside her, wide-eyed, clutching a blanket. She had seen herself in some of the videos too, her small face pressed against the window, her tears captured by strangers. "Am I on TV, Mama?" she asked softly. Sarah hugged her tighter, fighting the ache in her chest. "Yes, baby, but it's because the truth needs to be seen." Anthony moved through the house quietly, his calm presence anchoring them even as the storm raged. He had not wanted this spotlight, had never sought fame through scandal. But now, the truth was bigger than his own discomfort. He had become a symbol, whether he liked it or not, and symbols carried weight. By midnight, national networks had cut regular programming. A panel of commentators debated the footage, pausing frame by frame. Doyle's sneer, the baton crashing, Anthony's refusal, the gold badge flashing. One legal analyst said bluntly, "This officer is finished." What we are witnessing is a textbook example of abuse of authority, magnified by racial bias. Another added, "What's remarkable is Anthony Carter's restraint. He knew the trap. He knew the story could flip, and he refused to give them that. But the story wasn't just Anthony's anymore. It became a mirror for the nation. Clips of other encounters, traffic stops, wrongful arrests, unlawful searches resurfaced, tagged alongside number Carter driveway. The conversation grew louder. How many families endured humiliation without cameras? How many children watched their parents stripped of dignity without the world ever knowing? For Doyle, the flames consumed quickly. His supervisor arrived at the scene that night, but even before he stepped out of the cruiser, dispatch radios were crackling with the news. "Officer Doyle, you're to return your weapon and badge pending investigation." His hands shook as he unpinned the badge from his chest. He tried to argue, to insist he had followed procedure, but the viral videos drowned his words. His own department knew this was bigger than them now. Anthony, watching from his front porch, said nothing. He didn't need to. The roar of digital outrage was louder than any words he could have spoken. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to exhale, his hand resting gently on Maya's shoulder as she leaned against him. The next morning, headlines blazed across newspapers. FBI director assaulted by local cop. Editorials demanded accountability. Activists called for reform. And ordinary citizens shared their own stories in comment threads that read like a collective testimony. The driveway in Oak Creek had become more than a crime scene. It had become a symbol, a stage where prejudice had exposed itself to the light. Anthony knew this was only the beginning. The fire had spread, but fire without direction could burn out quickly. What mattered now was channeling it, shaping it into something more than outrage, into justice, into change. And that meant stepping out of the shadows, even if he wished only for peace. As he stood by the new window installers days later, he looked out at the cul-de-sac where it had all begun. Neighbors avoided eye contact, some ashamed, some still defensive, some quietly grateful. But he could feel it. Nothing in Oak Creek would ever be the same, and nothing in the country would either. The viral flames had been lit. The question now was what would rise from the ashes. And that answer would take us to the next chapter, the courtroom reckoning. The courthouse buzzed like a hive, cameras flashing outside as reporters shouted questions that echoed off marble columns. The nation had been waiting for this moment, the trial of Officer Mark Doyle. For weeks, the viral footage had dominated headlines, dissected by pundits, replayed in classrooms, and argued in living rooms. Now, the drama shifted from driveway to courtroom, where the stakes were higher and the judgment more final. Inside, the air was taut with anticipation. Every seat in the gallery was filled, journalists hunched over notepads, neighbors from Oak Creek whispering nervously, activists in T-shirts bearing slogans like "Justice has no address." At the defense table, Doyle sat hunched, his once square shoulders slumped forward, the crispness of his uniform replaced by a gray suit that fit awkwardly. His pale eyes darted around the room, unable to rest on anyone for long. His lawyer whispered in his ear, but Doyle's gaze kept straying to the front row where Anthony Carter sat with Sarah and Maya, their faces calm, resolute. Anthony had chosen a dark, tailored suit, his posture unshaken. He was not there to gloat. He was there as a husband, a father, and a witness to truth. He had carried himself the same way in every appearance since the incident, quiet, dignified, unwilling to let anger overshadow the larger story. Maya sat between her parents, her small hand gripping Anthony's, her wide eyes taking in the solemnity of justice in action. "All rise," the bailiff intoned as Judge Renee Mallory entered, her black robe flowing behind her like a wave. She was known for her no-nonsense demeanor, a woman who had presided over corruption cases and high-profile trials with equal firmness. She scanned the room, her eyes sharp. "Be seated." The prosecution began with the videos. Screen after screen played before the jury, the baton smashing glass, Doyle barking false commands, Anthony's calm refusal, Sarah's cries, Maya's tear-streaked face, the golden badge revealed. The footage was inescapable, undeniable. The jury leaned forward, expressions hardening. One clip in particular, slowed down to frame by frame, showed Anthony's stillness as Doyle shouted, "Stop resisting." The contrast was damning. "This is not just misconduct," the prosecutor declared, her voice ringing clear. "This is abuse of power. This is prejudice wielded like a weapon. And it happened not in an alley at night, not in a hidden corner, but on a man's own driveway, in front of his family, his neighbors, and now, the nation." She let the silence after her words hang, heavy and deliberate. The defense tried to counter. Doyle's lawyer argued stress, officer safety, and confusion. "My client believed he was investigating a possible crime. He misread the situation under pressure. He did not know Mr. Carter's identity at the time." The words sounded rehearsed, fragile against the weight of the videos. Stress did not explain the smirk when he said, "Good boy." Pressure did not justify the baton slamming into the glass. Confusion did not erase the humiliation etched into every second of footage. Doyle himself took the stand, his voice shaking as he spoke. He tried to sound contrite, to explain that he felt threatened, that Anthony's refusal escalated the situation. But the prosecutor cut him down with a single question. "Show this jury. Officer Doyle, where in this footage do you see resistance?" The courtroom monitors replayed Anthony's raised hands, his still body, his calm voice. "I am not resisting. I am standing still." The silence that followed was suffocating. Doyle swallowed hard, his eyes darting, his words stumbling. Neighbors testified too. The old man with the garden hose described the moment his jaw dropped watching the baton smash glass. The young mother with her toddler described the terror in Sarah's voice, the horror on Maya's face. One neighbor admitted, shame coloring his cheeks, "I thought Oak Creek was safe from this, but I saw it with my own eyes. Safe for whom? Not for them." His words rippled through the courtroom, hitting harder than any statistic. Finally, Anthony was called. He stepped to the witness stand, placing his hand on the Bible, his deep voice steady as he swore to tell the truth. The jury leaned in. This was the man they had seen in the videos, the man whose silence had carried more power than Doyle's shouts. "I stood on my driveway that day as a husband, a father, and a citizen," Anthony began, his tone calm, measured. "I was unloading boxes. I was not committing a crime. Yet I was treated as if my very existence was suspicious. I was told to show my papers. I was called names meant to strip me of dignity. And when I refused to surrender that dignity, I was assaulted." His words cut like glass, not angry, but precise. "The truth is in the footage. I did not resist. I did not fight. I stood still because I knew the story would be twisted if I moved. That is not just my story, it is the story of countless others whose names we do not know." His gaze swept the jury, the gallery, then landed on Doyle. But here, today, the truth has no place to hide. When he stepped down, Sarah's hand squeezed his, and Maya's eyes shone with pride. The courtroom was hushed, as if everyone had just witnessed something more than testimony. They had witnessed dignity turned into evidence. Closing arguments sealed Doyle's fate. The prosecutor spoke with controlled fire. "Power is not a license to humiliate. Authority is not immunity from accountability. The badge is supposed to protect." On that driveway, it was used to harm. That cannot stand. The jury deliberated only 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady. We find the defendant guilty on all counts: excessive force, deprivation of rights under color of law, and destruction of property. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, some cheers muffled quickly by the bailiff's calls for order. Doyle's head dropped into his hands, his lawyer whispering futile reassurances. The judge's voice cut through. Officer Mark Doyle, you are hereby sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution for damages and emotional distress. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell like thunder. Cameras outside exploded in light as the news raced across the country. The officer who humiliated the FBI director had been convicted. Anthony walked from the courthouse with Sarah and Maya at his side. He did not smile, did not celebrate. His face was solemn, his steps steady. He knew this was not just about one man's punishment. It was about a system forced to look at itself, if only for a moment. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward. Anthony paused, his voice calm as always. Today is not about me. It's about accountability. It's about the countless voices that are never heard, who never have cameras to prove their truth. This verdict is a step, but justice is a road, not a destination. The clip of that statement spread nearly as fast as the original video, replayed on news loops, shared on social media, and quoted in headlines. For the nation, the reckoning was not just Doyle's trial. It was the uncomfortable mirror it held up. And for Anthony, it was the moment he realized he could no longer remain in the shadows. He had become a voice, a symbol, and that meant stepping forward even further. Which leads us into the final chapter, from broken glass to broken system. The Lincoln Navigator had a new window now. The shards swept away, the spiderweb cracks replaced with polished glass that gleamed under the porch light. On the surface, the damage had been repaired. But Anthony Carter knew some fractures could not be erased. They lingered, invisible, running through the system itself like hairline cracks in stone. What had happened on his driveway was not an isolated act of rage. It was a symptom, a reflection, a warning. And the nation was finally forced to see it. Days after the verdict, Anthony stood at the podium in the press briefing room of the J. Edgar Hoover building. Rows of cameras pointed at him, reporters scribbling, the weight of expectation heavy in the silence before he spoke. He adjusted the microphone, his suit crisp, his face calm. The man the world had seen humiliated was now here by choice, stepping forward not just as a victim, but as the director of the FBI. A few weeks ago, he began, his voice steady, my family and I moved into what we hoped would be a peaceful new chapter. That peace was shattered not by a criminal, but by an officer sworn to protect. He saw me not as a husband, not as a father, not as a neighbor, but as a threat because of the color of my skin. That is the reality too many Americans live with daily. The only difference is that my story was caught on camera. Theirs are not. His words struck the room like a slow drumbeat. Reporters nodded, pens paused. Some even lowered their cameras for a moment to truly listen. Anthony continued. Millions endure humiliation, unlawful stops, wrongful searches, and excessive force. Most do not have the privilege of a gold badge in their wallet to shield them. Most do not have neighbors recording, and their dignity is stripped in silence. That must end. He announced a joint task force between the FBI and the Department of Justice designed to investigate patterns of misconduct nationwide. No longer just isolated cases, but entire departments would be reviewed. Funding would shift toward de-escalation training, body cam accountability, and community oversight. His words were not fiery, they were deliberate, grounded in the authority of a man who had nothing left to prove, but everything left to protect. Outside the building, protests swelled, signs waving with Anthony's words written across cardboard. Respect goes both ways, and justice has no address. Activists and community leaders praised his stance, while critics muttered about federal overreach. But the debate itself was proof of something undeniable. The cracks were no longer hidden. For Sarah, the weeks after the trial were a blur of interviews and quiet exhaustion. She often replayed that afternoon in her mind, Doyle's baton rising, the sound of shattering glass, the terror on Maya's face. Healing was slow, uneven. At night, she sometimes woke in cold sweats, hearing the echo of steel cuffs clicking shut. But each morning, when she watched Anthony rise with the same calm resolve, she found strength. His dignity had steadied her, and now she carried it forward too. Maya's healing was different. Children do not forget easily. She sometimes avoided looking at the navigator, flinching at the memory of its broken window. But slowly she began to ride her bike again in the cul-de-sac. Neighbors smiled awkwardly, waved too eagerly, as if trying to apologize without words. And each time Maya pedaled past, her curls flying in the wind, Anthony felt a spark of hope, that perhaps her memories of Oak Creek would not only be fear, but also resilience. One evening, Anthony stood in the doorway as Maya looped down the street, her laughter carrying across the twilight air. Sarah slipped her hand into his. "Do you think it will change anything?" she asked softly. Anthony watched his daughter circle back, her joy undimmed, her spirit unbroken. He thought of Doyle in his prison cell, stripped of power. He thought of the task force beginning its work, of officers across the nation watching the footage and knowing the world had shifted. He thought of the countless nameless victims whose stories had been silenced. He squeezed Sarah's hand gently. "I have to believe it will, because if I don't, then nothing changes, and we can't afford that, not for her." The driveway that had once been a battlefield was quiet again, but the echoes remained. The cracks exposed by Doyle's baton were more than broken glass. They were fissures in the foundation of justice itself. Yet through those cracks, light had poured in. In speeches that followed, Anthony often returned to that metaphor. "The baton shattered more than a window," he told a crowd at Howard University. "It shattered the illusion that wealth or gates could shield us from prejudice. But shattered glass reflects light. And in that reflection, we see the truth more clearly. The question is, what will we do with it?" For some, Doyle's 4-year sentence was enough. For others, it was far too light. But for Anthony, the true verdict was larger than one man's punishment. It was the beginning of a national reckoning. The hashtags had faded, the news cycle had moved on, but the conversations endured in classrooms, in precincts, in homes across America. The Carter driveway had become shorthand for injustice, but also for resilience. On a quiet Sunday, Anthony sat with Maya in the backyard, flipping through one of the photo albums from the box labeled Maya's Memories. She traced her small plaster handprint with her fingertip, then looked up at her father. "Daddy," she asked softly, "were you scared that day?" Anthony paused, then smiled gently. "Yes, sweetheart, I was scared. But I knew I couldn't show it, because you were watching. And sometimes, being brave isn't about not being scared, it's about standing still when it matters most." Maya leaned against him, and in that simple gesture, Anthony felt the purpose behind everything. He hadn't endured humiliation to protect only his dignity. He had endured it to protect hers and the dignity of children everywhere who deserved to grow up in a world that recognized their worth. The arc of the moral universe, Anthony knew, was long. But on his driveway, in front of neighbors, cameras, and his family, it had bent sharply, brutally, toward justice. And though the glass had been replaced, the memory of its shattering would never fade. It would remain as both scar and symbol, a reminder that justice always finds a way. And so, from broken glass to a broken system, Anthony Carter turned pain into purpose, humiliation into power, silence into a voice that could no longer be ignored. The driveway had been his battlefield. Now, it was his platform, and from it, a movement had begun. And so, what began as a quiet afternoon of unpacking boxes ended as a national reckoning. A shattered window became a shattered illusion. A driveway in Oak Creek Estates became a courtroom for the world. And a man's refusal to bow reminded us that dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken. Anthony Carter's story is not only his own. It belongs to every family that has felt suspicion shadow their steps, to every child who has seen fear in their parents' eyes, to every neighbor who has asked in silence, would this have happened if he looked different? His strength showed us that sometimes the loudest voice is the calmest one, and sometimes the greatest act of resistance is simply standing still. But the story doesn't end on that driveway. It continues with us with how we respond, how we demand accountability, how we choose to see each other. Justice is not a destination. It is a journey, step by step, truth by truth, voice by voice. So I ask you, what would you have done if it were your family, your home, your dignity on the line? And what will you do now, knowing this story is real for so many others who never make the headlines? If this story moved you, share it. Speak about it. Let it light a conversation in your home, your community, your city. And join us here as we continue to tell stories that matter, stories that reveal not just what is broken, but what can be healed. Don't forget to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel, because together, our voices are stronger. Together, we can turn silence into justice.